Hiya, Gwilym. How are you today, mate?
I'm very good, although I've made a bit of a mistake.
Oh, you sound very echoey. Are you in a cave somewhere?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the office, and so long since I've been in, I'm in the cave. No, I'm in the office. But I think it probably sounds quite cool.
Yeah, it makes you sound sort of like mysterious and almost kind of old worldy guru-ish.
Yeah, the guru is pretty cross. I've rated his cave, so yeah, but I'm hoping to train up.
Anyway, I thought we were kind of creeping towards something that felt a little bit like the old days because you and I had met in a pub. We went and did a podcast in a pub. I've been into the office for a few days. I know you've been in. You're there now, but I don't know. The COVID numbers seem to be rising daily. Hospitalisations and unfortunately deaths seem to be at levels that once we would have been quite aghast at, but now we kind of think are quite normal. I can't help but think that just around the corner there's something nasty coming our way by way of restrictions and stuff. I've got a sense that this thing is a long ways off being over, mate.
I've been making quite a few quite big plans,
Oh,
completely forgetting that we've just had a pandemic.
Or you're going to go off gallivanting somewhere or something, were you?
I'm getting married.
What?
Oh, right. Sorry.
What?
Lee, I'm getting married, old friends.
Oh, congratulations, mate. Is that why you're dressed up today? Is it today?
No. I've got that. Well, I love podcasting, but I don't think it goes on that well to do one during a wedding.
Things are quite exciting for me at the moment because I'm overseeing the council elections. It's our first live election for about 4 or 5 years. Is it sad that I get excited about things like that?
No, democracy is important. I'm up for election.
You are. You're up for election. Yeah, it's alongside a load of other serving council members who are trying to get back on again. And we've also got 3 new folk who are trying to get on council. So that's really, really good.
Don't do a party political podcast.
Well, you can, but by the time this podcast goes out, it'll all be done and dusted, and we'll know the result. So, won't be much good to you.
Okay, well, vote for me anyway, everyone.
Yeah. You're a shoo-in anyway, of course, mate.
Lee Davis and Gwilym Roberts are the 2 IPs in a pod, and you are listening to a podcast on intellectual property, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys.
We'll get onto the podcast in a moment, but I was reflecting about how much CIPA Council has changed in my almost 10 years at CIPA. We've got 27 folk on council, including the 3 officers, and only 10 of those were at my first council meeting. So we've seen 2/3 of council change in 10 years. That's got to be quite good, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's all good signs. I think fantastic contribution from all of the other 17 OBS, but it is important to keep the new blood coming in and make sure that we're reflecting all the different age groups within the profession.
Yeah, we now get 3 or 4 new people on every year, which is great. And when I started, there were only 4 women on council. We've got 10 now. So that shows that we're doing something right around diversity. We've got a lot more to do, of course. But I feel like we're making progress and just need to remind myself that we can always do better.
Agreed.
Anyway, on with the show, I think, because I could ramble on about CIPA governance forever and a day, and no one really wants to listen to me do that, do they? No, I'm getting people are shaking their heads at me, so that's obviously the case. So very early on in my time at CIPA, going back those 10 years ago to when I started, pretty much one of the first people that knocked on the door and came in to introduce himself was a guy by the name of Derek Chandler. And at that time, Derek was secretary of the Benevolent Association. And he knocked on my door and he said, you introduced himself. And he said, Lee, I know you're going to have lots of things to do. You're kind of new in the job and all that sort of thing. But I just thought I would come in early and say that you'd be very welcome as a trustee of the Benevolent Association. And I didn't have a clue what the Benevolent Association was, to be honest, then. But I said to Derek, yes, I'd do it because I thought it might be a way of me getting an insight into the world that our members live and work in. Benevolent Association was created 85 years ago, Gwilym. Can you believe that? Currently, Secretary Sam Funnell is joining us today to talk about the Benevolent Association, its history and its work. Sam, it's really lovely to have you on the podcast. Say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. So I was trained by Derek Chandler. And that's my connection with the Benevolent Association. He, in fact, handed the Benevolent Association over to me in a very similar manner to the way that he used to hand files over to me. So in the early 90s, I would get a big fat bundle of papers held together by a slightly dodgy elastic band or even a bit of pink ribbon on occasions. They smelled heavily of cheroots because you were allowed to smoke in the office in those days. And he would hand it over and say, see what you make of that. He did much the same with the Benevolent Association
I
about
remember it well.
25 years later, except it wasn't just a file, it was a boot full of papers, which are all now in my attic. That's how I really understood about the Benevolent Association, is from Derek. Back in the day, a piece of paper used to fall out of the CIPA journal every year or so, inviting us to an AGM and to pay some fees. That was my connection into the Benevolent Association, and Derek just said, I think you'll be a good secretary, would you like to take over from me? I'll help you. So I said yes. Sadly, Derek was slightly iller than we
sadly
actually knew at the time, but much of the credit of regarding the state of the Benevolent Association is down to him and his work.
And I suspect Derek probably knew his time was limited and was doing his best to make sure the Benevolent Association was in good order by making sure that you were there at the helm, Sam.
Thank you very much.
We're also joined, by way of your invitation, by Dr. Duncan Needham. All I know about Duncan, I met him for the first time last week when we did the little podcast briefing thing. I know he's something of an expert in the rise of benevolent associations in the professions in that period between the two wars. And I think Duncan's come along today to help us understand the social and economic context of the work of benevolent associations. So Duncan, big welcome to 2IPs to you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you for asking me along, Lee and Sam. So I am an economic historian, primarily, here at the University of Cambridge, where I teach, amongst other things, the economic history of interwar Britain. So I can give a little bit of background on the economic conditions that were there in interwar Britain, because it wasn't a very good time for the economy, as we put it that way. Great depression around the world, a slump in the UK. But before I came to Cambridge, I worked in the city for 15 years as a bond trader, then as a credit trader and credit fund manager. So I could also say a little bit perhaps about the investments that the Benevolent Fund made when it was set up in the 1930s.
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to this one because I have a passing interest in the world of professions, obviously, because I lead one. And benevolent associations have always been a feature of that. And I've never really thought about why did it all start. So it'd be fascinating to get inside that. So Sam, where should we kick off? Should we kick off with, well, you've told us a little bit about how you came to inherit the Benevolent Association. We probably ought to say that you don't do it entirely on your own. You've got a bunch of trustees around you. Probably important to point that out.
Yes, we do, and we have a treasurer as well. So, more importantly, I'm not entitled to play with the money. That's somebody else's job. Although I do theoretically have access to the bank account. Every time I actually try and get on, I find I've been locked out, and I have to get another dongle from the bank. So it's probably all for the best. I'm not allowed anywhere near the money.
And I think it's fair to say that when we make decisions about how to use the Benevolent Association's funds, it's always consensus. We do look across the group of trustees and make sure that we are in agreement with the things that we do. We do. One of the things that, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way whatsoever, but one of the things that first struck me when I was asked to become a trustee, knowing very little about the world of patent attorneys. I mean, I parachuted into this job from further education. I knew nothing about the world of legal services at all. And any other outsider might think the same. And that it's quite strange that in a rewarding profession such as the law, there's a need for benevolence. I know you can't go into details of individuals or specific cases, but can you give us a flavour of the sort of stuff the Benevolent Association does?
Yeah, sure, of course. So we tend to work with either patent attorneys themselves or their immediate family members, so wives and children, dependents and things like that. And usually what we find is that there are a combination of circumstances that mean that somebody is in need of some kind of assistance in some way. And so oftentimes the need for assistance is quite urgent and quite immediate. And that's one of the great advantages of our Benevolent Association, is that we can be quite fast moving and quick to respond and quick to deliver some kind of financial or other support in a relatively rapid way. So what'll happen is most people could survive one of a number of things, like having a major illness in a family or something else of those kind of natures. But when somebody has two or three of those things all happen at the same time, it can be quite hard for them to sort of navigate their way through. We generally only support a few people at any one time, and the the interesting thing about going back through the very early minutes is that they too were only ever helping a couple of people at any one time. There were initially two widows who were being supported, and then there was an elderly gentleman, and then subsequently his widow, who were being supported through this time. And that generally seems to be the flavour of the Benevolent Association, is that they provide assistance to a limited number of people, but oftentimes for quite long periods of time, so a couple of decades sometimes. And that, can make an enormous difference to that family as they go through life. Sometimes people come off the Benevolent Association and sometimes people stay for a long time. It just depends.
So 85 years is a long time to have been doing that, or it feels it in my mind. Duncan, can I switch over to you? And before we talk about the founding of CIPA's Benevolent Association, and I know that Sam's done a huge amount of work on that, can you tell us a little bit about why they came into such prevalence during those interwar years?
I think it's possibly a couple of things. I mean, as I said, the interwar years were very difficult years for the British economy. So we had, really from 1921, really until just about the outbreak of the Second World War, unemployment in this country never really dipped below about 10%. So it was a hugely difficult time for the economy. And actually, once we got out of the slump in about 1931, so the British economy emerged from the slump a little bit earlier than the American economy and the German economy and the French economy. It was growing reasonably fast in the 1930s, but that unemployment proved to be really stubborn. So you got pretty high unemployment, particularly regional unemployment, really badly affected regions where previously industry and heavy industry had been concentrated. So you've got a pretty weak economic backdrop. But I think also important here, and just picking up on some of the things that Sam's mentioned there, you've also got, we're in a time here before the welfare state today as we know it.
Awesome.
And if you fell upon hard times, or if you were a widow, living off benefit was not a lifestyle choice in those days. I've got some figures here for what somebody could expect, and this is an adult male with 3 children would get about 30 shillings. So about £1.50 now. Obviously, £1.50 in those days was worth an awful lot more than £1.50 is today. But that's what you got to live on, a man with 3 children. That would be about half the average weekly wage at the time.
Right. Now,
Sam's mentioned that, the couple of individuals that we see in the early minute books are widows, and then there's also an elderly, and he looks sort of quite incapacitated from the minutes as well. The welfare state is not going to keep you in any sort of comfort. And after 1931, you can see in the minute books here, your unemployment benefit is cut in half pretty much after about 6 months, if you're not able to work, which the individual, the elderly gentleman in this case, clearly wasn't. And you see, unfortunately, that he dies sort of shortly afterwards. So it's really not a very generous welfare state. And just the final sort of part of that is that you've got no NHS. And you can see in the early minute books here that one of the widows has a pretty substantial doctor's bill. So £5. I mean, that's really 5 weeks welfare going on a single doctor's bill. So if you got sick, and it's Sam's point about, it's often a combination of things come together. One is that, she's widowed. 2 is, she's not really getting very much widow's benefit. But then if you fall ill and you have to pay, a £5 doctor's bill, which is, a multiple of your weekly allowance to live on, that really puts you into some economic distress. And that's why a benevolent association such as this, can be a lifeline for these people.
It's obviously quite important at this time then. Sorry, Gwilym.
No, I was just going to ask if that's kind of an echo of Victorian philanthropy, that people who've fallen on good times felt they should share their benefit.
Oh, very much. And that's very much an echo of what, we can go back sort of to Mr. Gladstone in the middle and towards the end, because this was exactly how he thought organizations and people should deal with what we refer to sometimes in the historical literature as life cycle poverty. The idea is that you go through different phases of your life. Today, for instance, our students don't have an awful lot of money. One hopes that when they graduate, they'll go and get that wonderful job at Goldman Sachs, and then they'll be a little bit better off. But then they'll buy a house and they'll have kids, and they'll be worse off again. So you go through this life cycle, and the idea was that organizations. Gladstone didn't want the state to be looking after people in the way that it does now. He was very much a classic 19th century liberal, but he was absolutely in favor of this sort of thing, which was that, you know, your profession or even your trade union should be there for you, and should be there to look after its own, basically. So he loved the idea of building societies, loved the idea of benevolent funds, loved the idea of mutual organizations where, you know, all the members would be asked to put a little bit away, and you'd have an insurance policy essentially to look after people who'd fallen on hard times.
So, Sam, if we take a look at the coming into being of the CIPA Benevolent Association, you've been doing a lot of research, I know. What did you discover deep in the archives about the founding?
I couldn't find very much about the reasons or the originators. There's a mention in passing in one of the transactions. Somebody's speech was we needed to do some benevolence, and that was in the kind of 1935 type area. And by 1936, there was a definite movement behind it. I have a suspicion from reading the minutes that the two widows were already being supported by the generosity of CIPA in some informal way, and therefore the need to sort of create more benevolence and to formalise it was already there. I also note that the original call for money and donation was not met by a significantly adequate response, according to the secretary, who I believe was also the secretary of the Institute at the same time. He sends a slightly stroppy note out, which is cut and pasted into the minute book, which says the minority of fellows responded promptly and generously. The majority, over 75% of fellows, made no response whatever. So they did have to have a bit of a sort of arm twisting campaign. I also note from the early minutes that a lot of the AGM meetings, the annual meetings, were happened at the end of the year, which I suspect coincided with a Christmas or New Year's Eve dinner, and there might have been a reasonable amount of arm twisting going on at that point. The structure of the Benevolent Association was originally very closely tied to CIPA and the CIPA Council. So the president of the CIPA Council is also an honorarium of the Benevolent Association. That went away as a sort of formal thing that we could do with the Charities Act and our need to for the Benevolent Association to be properly independent of council and CIPA. And so we tend not to do that anymore. I do know that Dr. Thurston was the originator of the suggestion for the fund, but refused to allow his name to be added to any of the formal paperwork. You know, we know that the original membership fees were proposed to be 1 guinea, but suggested to be appropriately 2 guineas. And that if you wanted a life subscription, it was £26, 5 shillings. And that by the end of 1936, they had £850 in hand, and some generous soul had paid for the buying of a cupboard and a nameplate and a seal and starting the bank account and that kind of stuff. So I believe it all happened and it was all looked after in the CIPA offices, because the address was the Staple Inn Buildings.
I've got a theory on that. I was just looking at the paperwork that you sent pictures of, and it's the anonymous donor. That's got to be Dr. What's his face, Dr. Thurston, isn't it?
Probably. There are various other donations made throughout the period of time. So I think they were all there, because we have a Tennant, a Cartmale, a Jennings, Thompson,
That's a fantastic list of names actually involved in it. All their Duncan, they're all names of firms now. So it's all the kind of the players. I was just going to mention one thing I'm quite conscious of, which probably again ties in with the kind of each looking after their own kind of vibe at the time, which is I know that the partnership deeds tended to be the partners were looked after, obviously, and then after that, the partners' spouses were looked after. And I'm pretty sure in my firm, not long before I became a partner, the spouses were finally written out. But also a lot of firms made some very generous pension arrangements that they regretted for the next 50 years. I don't know if that was a common theme as well, but firms looking after their own was very interesting.
Indeed, and I think if people didn't make it to partner, then they might well have struggled quite a lot. So I had some questions for Duncan, if you don't mind, that I would like to know the answer.
Oh, take over, Sam. Take over, by all means.
Thank you. So how live membership at £26 5 how much was that in relation to a good kind of professional salary? Was that a lot of money or?
Oh goodness. Well, as average weekly wages, this is for a sort of fairly unskilled job, would be about £3 a week. So what's that? £150 a year. I'd expect obviously a professional salary to be, some multiple of that. So I mean, if we went, let's say, I don't know, three times, just for the sake of argument, so £450, so 25. That's what? That's oh gosh, my bond trade arithmetic is failing me, but that's about a 20th, I think, isn't it? So what would that be? I mean, very, very roughly, something like a month's salary for a firm.
Okay, so that's a wedding ring, that's an engagement ring.
Right. Yes. I mean, it's meaningful. Yeah.
Okay. There's mention of the fact that they had £850 in hand, but they were worried about supporting any more than the 2 widows that they had. So what kind of interest rate would you get on £850 on deposit?
So what they've invested in, and this was quite interesting for me, what they've invested in is this particular bond issue called the 3.5% war loan. Now, the 3.5% war loan was issued in 1932. And what it effectively did was there were 3 big war loans taken out during the First World War. And what the 1932 war loan did was it consolidated all of those. And that's pretty standard. If you go right back to 1688, Glorious Revolution, Britain was at war, recovering from the last war or preparing for the next war pretty much all the time. That's how you get to become a great power, by being pretty much constantly at war, mostly with the French and periodically with the Americans, the Spanish, and the Dutch. So there was this pattern. Britain would, and you always pay for a war with borrowing, because if you try and tax the present generation, the war better be popular if the present generation are going to have to fight, and B, pay for the whole thing as well. So what you generally do is you kick the can down the road, you borrow, a bit like we're doing for the pandemic at the moment, and you tax future generations. So roughly, and the First World War was the most expensive war ever to that time, and about 2/3, 3/4 of it was paid for with borrowing. What happens is during a war, you've got to borrow at a high percentage. So the last big war loan was at 5%, which in the context of the time was very, very expensive borrowing. That war loan was £2.1 billion. That was about 50% of GDP. So the equivalent today would be, a British government bond issue of about, what would that be? About £1.25 trillion, which would just be, it was enormous. And merely servicing the interest on that 5% was taking up 12.5% of all government spending. So before the politicians could, it was just enormous. And this was the major problem of the 1930s, that the economy is in a slump. The government doesn't want to raise any more taxes because that'll push the economy further into slump. But before you can start building roads, hospitals, schools, all the things that politicians love to do, you've got to find 12.5% of all your taxable income just to pay the interest on the First World War debt. And you've got this enormous issue outstanding. So what they did in 1932 was interest rates came down, and they were able to it was called a conversion. You basically reconstruct the bond at the lower rate, and investors basically have to swallow it. So at lower interest rates, you have a conversion. You either get your money back or you convert into the lower bond at 3.5%. Now, some people didn't convert, in which case you get your money back. But you can imagine, if a big chunk of those people didn't convert, the government's got, or the Bank of England's got to print money to the tune of about half of the entire GDP to pay everyone back. And that's going to cause just enormous inflation, pumping that amount of money into the economy. So the conversion was a success. The vast majority of people did invest. did convert rather. But what you end up with is this super liquid bond. And that's why benevolent funds such as this would have invested in it, because it's a super liquid bond. It's enormous. It's £2 billion. And so the point is you can get in and out of it very, very quickly. Because it's a very liquid instrument. And so it's absolutely ideal for these purposes. If you need to just, you've accrued another, say, £100 in subscriptions over the year, you can just go and buy another 100. If you're paying out to, these widows and the retired patent attorney, you can sell a little bit and you can get in and out. As I say, it's very, very liquid. And also during the 1930s, you didn't have much inflation. You actually had a little bit of deflation during the Depression. So it would have held its value. Now, I don't know what the particular rules for this fund would have been, but I'm involved in a sort of similar things as a governor of my college here and also as a governor of a school. And you're generally not allowed to spend the principal. So the income that they can spend will only be that 3.5%, which is why, the first time you sort of read through and you think, well, you've got all this money, 800 quid, and you're only supporting these two widows. Well, that doesn't seem very generous, but they were probably only allowed to spend the 3.5% that they were earning as income from the fund, I'm assuming.
Yes, and they could spend annual fees that people paid in, but they couldn't, as you say, they couldn't spend the capital.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask the treasurer whether we're allowed to dip into the capital now. It hasn't happened in my time. We haven't needed to. We've been very lucky in that way. Yeah. So the other thing that was mentioned in the minutes was that this was the funds were not for the benefit of the staffs of patent agents. It was fellows only, and the staffs were expected to be supported by an assurance society. Is that one of these insurance type arrangements that you've just been talking about?
Yeah, I think so. And they will have paid in, a bit like paying. This is before we had the national insurance system, but you would have paid in, an amount as into your own industry assurance fund, and that would have paid you out in the event of unemployment. So what William Beveridge, who sort of puts together the welfare state during the Second World War, and it's launched after the Second World War, what he's doing is basically building on all these different models and just sort of consolidating the whole thing and saying, well, instead of having your assurance policy is, I don't know, the miners fund or the engineers fund or whatever it may be, we'll just consolidate it all, and the state will become the insurer because it can do it on a larger scale and run the thing more efficiently. But the idea when unemployment insurance was first introduced was that you only got out what you paid back in. And once you had, say, 6 months of unemployment and you got out what you paid back in, well, you're on your own by that stage.
Indeed. In 1945, the treasurer has clearly asked the bank, and the bank has come back and indicated that we should change our holding. And there's a note that after discussion, it was resolved that the total holding of the 3.5% war loan amounting to £1,926, 16 shillings and 8p be realised, and the proceeds invested in 3% savings bonds. I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about what happened at the end of the war with regard to this loan stock.
Yeah, so I was a little bit confused by that, because the 3.5% savings bond was a smaller issue, and I need to spend a little bit more time looking at it, because they seem to be getting out of a very large, very liquid issue into a smaller issue that's actually returning them a little bit less. So I'd say it's not immediately obvious what's going on there, and I don't know what they invested in today, but I hope it's not government bonds, because
no.
over the post-war period, the value of bonds like that is, the purchasing power has gone down enormously because we've had so much inflation since the Second World War, and that's why a lot of these funds will have gone into equities, really from the late 1950s onwards, because you've got persistent moderate inflation, but then high inflation in the 1970s. But it does seem like a curious one, and I'm afraid, without digging a little bit deeper in, there's no obvious answer, I'm afraid.
Okay. And then the final question was, in respect of the 3.5% war loan, something interesting happened in, I think it was 2015 or 2016. What was that? That's
right. So this war loan was finally redeemed by the then Chancellor, George Osborne, because, while interest rates were, interest rates are at the lowest they've ever been in human history at the moment. But nobody really anticipated until after the global financial crisis that interest rates would get, or long-term interest rates would get below 3.5%. And they did. And so if you can redeem the debt, all these bonds, they're always callable at par. So the government is able to retire the bonds at 100 at face value. So if the interest rate goes below 3.5%, the value goes up to 100, and it never goes up above 100 because the government always has the right to buy it back off you at 100. Now, if you can issue new debt for less than 3.5% annual coupon, it's actually a sensible thing to do. It saves the taxpayer money. And given that long interest rates have been below 3.5% since, well, pretty much since the global financial crisis hit us about 12 or 13 years ago, it's actually a sensible thing to do. So this bond was redeemed by the then Chancellor George Osborne, and it helped. It was sort of on the anniversary or around the anniversary of the First World War. So he made quite a big splash, saying we finally paid off our war debt. Except he hasn't, because we still owe the Americans some of the war debt that we borrowed off them, which the Treasury wishes everyone could forget about.
We did invite George Osborne to come on the podcast. He was unresponsive, probably a little busy doing other things, but there we are.
Get Rishi. I thought it was, Sam, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Duncan. A couple of questions. Just out of interest, Duncan, so you were a bond trader. Were you a historian, then a bond trader, then a historian, or how's that?
Well, my undergraduate degree was in history and politics, and then like many people of my generation, we got sucked into the city and financial services. So I was a bond trader, and then I decided to take a year off in 2008 because it seemed like a good time to take a year off from trying to trade one's way through the financial crisis. And I
nothing to do with me.
No, exactly. You haven't seen me. I was off. Sharp exit. No, I came to Cambridge to study financial crises. Actually, I did a master's dissertation on a particular financial crisis in the 1970s. But I was enjoying myself so much here, I never went back. Which the plan was to go back, but I've never quite made it back yet. So historian, then trader, and now historian again.
Again, a nice arc. Actually, no, we had a look at some point the impact of financial crisis on intellectual property and patenting, by the way, but that's a different story. But if you're looking for a research topic, it's quite interesting. There's some really strong correlations. So that was my first question. Just going back to prices really quickly. I'm a big George Orwell fan, and the most memorable bit about his book, The Road to Wigan Pier, is the shopping list. And I just dug it out, actually. It's from 1937. It's absolutely fascinating. And this was unemployed coal miners with, hang on a second, 2 children aged 2 and 5 and a baby. And yeah, his total outgoings weekly were £1, 12 shillings and 0 pence. Very interesting, including an amazing 10 pence a week on dripping. It's a wonderfully itemised. I thought that was free. I thought that came off the meat, which he spent, hang on, £2 2 and 6 on. So anyway, fascinating fact, nicely contemporaneous as well.
Well, so very interesting. It reminds me of Mr. McCorber. So you're saying £1 and 12 shillings outgoings. So average weekly benefits, according to the list I have here, in what year was that? 19.
The book was written in 37.
37. Okay. No. Well, funnily enough, average weekly benefits for a married man with 3 children, 32 shillings, which is exactly £1 and 12 shillings.
Whoa.
So he's spot on.
They were good at what they did. And I was also, Sam, you sent those wonderful pictures of bits and pieces of the Benevolent Association papers. And I've got a couple of comments. One you've touched on already, which is just the wonderful list of names of luminaries of the time, all of whom either had founded or went on to found patent firms. So it's interesting connection between kind of the entrepreneurial and the philanthropic spirit, perhaps, which is quite cool. The second thing is that the main document on the first one here, which is signed by Mr. Farwell, I don't know, presumably the Farwell clan.
Yeah.
Because we have clans, Duncan, in this. It's like ancient Scotland. It's terrifying. It's on I've never heard it. It's on a BOA patent file.
I know. I've got it right here. It's glued in as well, so I can't get it out. And he's written on the front of it, retain indefinitely. And he's written a note for any subsequent secretary. which is almost indecipherable, but says, in my opinion, it would be a great pity not to keep the historical record, given the old claimant papers as a guide to a new secretary unobtainable in any other way. W. Farwell, 16th of August, 1988.
It's almost as if you knew we'd do a podcast about it.
Absolutely, isn't it? It's just, yeah. I am particularly impressed by the absolutely exquisite copperplate handwriting in the minute books. They're just, I mean, they're just beautifully written.
Does that not still happen, Sam?
I have a feeling that most patent attorneys now write like doctors do. Which is why we all still need secretaries as the only people who can actually read our handwriting. There are a couple of question mark in the minutes that I transcribed because I just can't read the names or work out what they were saying. Talking about the entrepreneurial spirit, Gwilym. Sorry, I'll say that again. Talking about the entrepreneurial spirit, Gwilym. Did you see the radical suggestion by Mr. M. Strode that the annual accounts and reports should be duplicated instead of printed?
Morris was another visionary, yes.
Clearly didn't go down well. We carried on with the printed copy and we didn't duplicate.
Two other comments. First of all, I can't quite make it out. What does it say? What's the strap line above the BOA patent file? There's a little thing in quotes.
Grips like the coils of a boa.
What happened to BOA patent files? What a loss. And also, Sam, you obviously, when you photographed these, I'm assuming you did them at home. Can I just congratulate you on your soft furnishings?
They're lovely, aren't they?
And the vibe from some of the cushions here. Very pretty.
We have a particular technical problem, which is that my husband's got such a heavy weight lens on the camera that as soon as you tilt it off horizontally, it gradually zooms in. So
I thought you were going somewhere entirely different with that. When you said my husband's got such a heavy weight, I thought you were going to say that he ruins the soft furnishings.
He does ruin the software and the furnishings too. Don't tell him that.
Sam, you used a word earlier, which I interestingly searched for in all of the documents and couldn't find. Question for you, but also question for Duncan, because I'm sure this resonates across other benevolent associations. I couldn't see the word charity in that history that takes us through those formative years. Couldn't see the word charity, so I had no sense of the status of the association when it was founded, or when and why it became a charity.
No, you're right. Charity isn't mentioned at all. Benevolence is, and necessitas and other things like that. But it wasn't viewed as a charity, and it only formally, I think, became recognised as a charity when, with the Charities Act and the need to sort of separate these benevolent associations from the institutes and organisations that they supported. But Duncan, maybe talk a bit more about that.
I'm just pondering here whether there might have been a negative association with the word charity, whether that might have been associated with, bear in mind we've got workhouses up until, they really not got rid of until about 1930. So, the idea of going into the workhouse and being on charity might have still resonated with that generation in the 1930s. And charity was something that, that really was, it's sort of Dickensian, if you're relying on charity. And the idea of benevolence, and actually it is a self-help organization, and this is not, falling upon the parish, for instance. It might have just had a slightly sort of higher connotation than the use of the word charity.
So, in terms of where we are now, Sam, the Benevolent Association is in funds, it has money. Does it need more? Should we be putting out a call for...
Well, interestingly, there was a lot of very fine work done by the trustees in the 80s, I think, and they did significant fundraising and investing at that point. So we currently invest in M&G Chari funds, and we, our accounts are public, so you can see that we have a reasonable chunk of change in the bank. We don't get in anywhere near the amount of money that we used to get in from the profession, it used to be possible for partnerships to actually give a donation and for us to be able to claim gift aid on the partnership donation. That's not possible now because the rules have changed, and you have to gift aid on individual donations associated with an individual taxpayer. But we do still get donations in. We get occasional bequests and things like that. But most of the time, we're living on the interest. So, but we seem to be doing quite well. We'd never say no to more money, I think. And if people do want to fundraise for the Benevolent Association, then we would always be very, glad to receive that money. But actually, I think for us, it's more important that we also are able to spend the money on the people that might deserve it. The list of potential beneficiaries is actually quite limited if it's limited to just fellows or members of the institute. And if we talk about what the next 85 years might bring, I think we probably are going to have to update and change our governance structures to be much more close to a charity and as understood under the Charities Act. And that would mean having lay trustees and
well, that would be quite a change, wouldn't it?
It would be, yes. We might then be able to also change more of the kind of things that we could support. So we could have a much stronger focus on supporting younger members of the profession, on focusing on supporting mental health and other things like that as well. So, and possibly we might also merge with the Benevolent Association for Trademark Attorneys.
We're not allowed to use the merger word.
Well, we would be an independent charity at that point, and so nothing to do with either of you lot. I'm just suggesting, I'm just putting it out there because we have some interesting notes in the accounts about Fund A and Fund B, some of which were funded before the trademark attorneys split, and some of which were funded after.
Duncan is waving his gloriously multicoloured pen, which is a favourite of academics, I know. So,
well, it was just picking up on that point about gift aid, because there's a note in the minutes to suggest that the Benevolent Fund could reclaim the tax on donations, and I have to say that surprised me. I didn't know that the notion of, I'm sure it wasn't called gift aid in the 1930s, but I was surprised to see that notion was there. The other thing, the other point is just something that's pertinent to some of the funds that we look at within the university. We've obviously got colleges here that are some of them 800 years old, and one of the issues that we have with our scholarships is that they're just too tightly circumscribed. This scholarship is only available to the third grandson of a vicar from North Dorset. So one of the things we have to do is sort of revisit all our ancient scholarships and try to make them a little bit wider, because the original purposes that they were given for was just offer, and we want to give the money away, and we just can't because they're too narrowly circumscribed. So I feel your pain there in terms of the decisions. And of course, Sam,
the profession in the now is changing. We now have paralegals as professionals within CIPA.
We do.
Yep. So not so much the staffs of patent attorneys, but also very much a sort of a paralegal profession. So
we do. We also have and have had for a number of times formal employees of the institute, formal employees of the regulators. So there are an increasing range of potential beneficiaries who wouldn't necessarily benefit from our resources under the current rules.
Sure.
If we aren't able to change and adapt. And we have to look to the rules that govern us now, not the rules that governed the creation of this in 1936. I think if we're going to maintain a relevant and appropriate benevolent association.
Maybe by way of bringing us to a close, because I'm conscious of time. If someone's listening to this and they're thinking to themselves, actually, I think I could do with a little bit of help. Sometimes it's quite difficult to even admit that to yourself, isn't it? So, so if they get themselves to a place whereby they think that maybe the Benevolent Association could help me in some way, what should they do?
In the first instance, they can either contact the Institute, or they can email me or find me, secretary@cipabenevolent.org.uk. Is how you reach me. Every submission application is treated as confidential, both by me and by all of the trustees. We limit who can see the financial information that anyone might provide. And they just reach out to us and say, this is who I am, and this is why I am necessitous. Actually, what sometimes is more useful is if somebody else approaches us and says, could you reach out to X person, because we think they might be struggling and they might need some help. And we can often turn up and sort of tap on the door and say, by the way, have you heard of the Benevolent Association? We think you might qualify for support.
Okay.
And oftentimes, the particular recipient has never heard of us, and that can be a particularly useful thing for partners and former colleagues to do, is to actually say, I happen to know about somebody I think they could benefit. So that's why we want to get the news about the association and what we do out to the wider profession, so that they can help us identify potential beneficiaries.
So the anniversary is a great chance to do that. It's a great way of
absolutely,
telling a story. I've been fascinated by the story I've heard today. Learned so much. So thank you both for that. It's a great story to tell, isn't it? And we need to make sure that our members both know the history, but also know the future potential.
Indeed. Yep. Yes.
Gwilym, anything to say in closing?
No, I'm glad that we used to be benevolent. Yes, obviously. Why did I say no when I then said something? Yes, I have got something. No, it's just amazing to hear. I love the histories. Nice to get these little insights we get. It's fascinating. It's good to hear how benevolent the business was, and let's keep it benevolent.
Well, Sam, Duncan, thank you both so much for sharing your time, your expertise with us. It's been great having you on. I've learned so much. I could carry on for a long time, but unfortunately, pressure of time means we need to come to a close. Gwilym, cheers for turning up again, mate. It's always good that you do. And I'll see you on the next one, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.